50 years ago, the CBS News documentary Hunger in America brought national attention to a major hunger crisis in this country, something that many people at the time thought was only an issue in other countries.
The documentary also sparked changes in legislation. Despite the improvements, millions of people in the U.S. still struggle with hunger today. Here's part of that report from 1968.
You have how many children to feed?
10.
10 children?
Yeah.
Are there times when you don't have enough food at the house to go around?
Yes, lots of time.
There are times
Just have to make out what I have, give each one of them a little what I have.
What did you have for dinner today?
I didn't have any dinner.
You're going to have a baby before long.
Yes.
What kind of food do you eat?
Rice, chicken sometimes.
What else do you eat?
That's all. Water.
Bob Greenstein is the founder and president of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Stacy Dean is the vice president for food assistance policy at the center. And they're joining us both from Washington. Thank you so much for joining us, guys. You know, this documentary aired in 1968, so people may not be aware of the type of impact that it had, how people thought about hunger and food insecurity in America versus what the documentary showed them. That's for either of you guys. Just sort of give us an idea of the impact that this doc had.
The documentary really had a huge impact. There was beginning to be some understanding that there were very serious hunger and malnutrition problems, especially in parts of Appalachia, the South, Native American reservations, and elsewhere. And there had begun to be teams of doctors going in and finding this. It had begun to trickle into the conversation, some news coverage, but I think most Americans were unaware. The CBS documentary, Hunger in America, basically crystallized all of that was going on and put it before a massive national audience. You know, we only had 3 networks then. CBS was key. Tens of millions of people watched the documentary, and the impact was instant. George McGovern, a senator from South Dakota, reported multiple times in the years afterwards that the documentary blew him away, and that he went the next day after seeing the documentary to the floor of the Senate to offer a resolution to set up a bipartisan select committee of the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs. And that committee, with Senator Bob Dole of Kansas as the key Republican, held hearings around the country. It followed up on the documentary for years of building on it, learning more, building an evidence base, and ultimately providing the basis for major bipartisan anti-hunger legislation that really had a very large impact in dramatically reducing the extreme hunger and the rates of child malnutrition at that time, which in some parts of the country were akin to the rates in third world nations. So this is really, I think, one of the most powerful impacts that any particular piece of media has had in this country probably over the last 50 years.
And Stacey, Bob makes a good point in that this one news reporting had such a tremendous impact across the country because we only had essentially 3 television news networks delivering the news back in those days. Today, in this fractured media landscape that we live in, many people would be surprised to know that there are Americans still in 2018 who are suffering from hunger. Give us a sense of the landscape today.
Well, that's right. There are people, many families, about 12, 13%, who just struggle to put food on the table every day. They don't earn enough to cover their daily food needs. And that's why it's so important that the federal nutrition programs like SNAP and the school meals programs step in and help fill the void. I think that daily struggle, the seniors who don't have enough money and have to choose between rent, medicine, and food, that so many of our neighbors and members of our community deal with this issue every day. And so that's a reality. But it's also a reality. What's so different from the late 60s is that we have a very powerful federal response in the way of the federal nutrition programs, the Supplemental Nutrition Program, or food stamps as it used to be known. The role that it plays, I think, is equally not understood, the problem and the solution.
So I wonder whether or not you have concerns about this administration. I think we can recall the White House budget when it came out, and that talk of maybe rolling back food stamps and replacing it with a box full of food instead, and other sort of attempts to sort of roll back these support systems for people who are food insecure. The Farm Bill just failed, but it would have created requirements for work if people were receiving food stamps. Are you concerned about the current administration and how they perceive people who are food insecure? Or hungry?
Yeah.
I'll just say hungry, because I know food insecure is sort of the phrasing that we're using now, but people who are without food who are going hungry.
Right, or just the daily struggle. I think that whatever word you use, we're talking about hardship and the inability to meet the needs of your family. We do worry very much that the administration and some policymakers in Congress just aren't in touch with those issues and concerns of so many Americans. But more important, the overwhelming body of evidence about how effective SNAP is as a solution to those issues, how it reduces poverty, reduces hunger or food insecurity, and it's a really effective long-term investment in children. Children that are able to receive this benefit when they're very young do better in school, have better health, and have better employment outcomes. So what we want to make sure is whatever moves forward, it's informed by the evidence, and that's our hope for the Farm Bill moving forward.
Bob, sorry, Bob,
I'm just going to say it's also important to learn from history. Sometimes policymakers do, but sometimes they don't. So before the SNAP program, what used to be called the food stamp program, really came into existence and became a national program, we had something not that dissimilar from the food boxes that the White House proposed. It was called the old Commodity Distribution Program, and poor people could go to a county warehouse and get a box of food. On a bipartisan basis, from President Nixon and Bob Dole to Hubert Humphrey and George McGovern, and medical researchers and authorities and nutrition experts, right, left, and center, everyone agreed that that was a failed approach. It had all kinds of problems. The foods that mainly ended up in the warehouses were surplus foods that farmers otherwise weren't selling, and they often were heavy in fat, high in sodium, low in nutritional content. Often they were foods individual families couldn't eat given their dietary patterns. They didn't get the opportunity to select the foods that were best for them. And because you had to go to a county warehouse and get this box of food, if you didn't have a car, if you had a disability, if you were a senior, you often had trouble navigating it. You had to pay someone to drive you to get your box of food. And everyone across the political spectrum agreed in the early 70s that giving people vouchers, which is effectively what food stamps or SNAP does, to go into the grocery store and buy the foods that worked for you was a far superior approach. So I'm happy to say that while the White House included that proposal in its budget, it's not going anywhere on Capitol Hill. People across the political spectrum on the Hill, I think, have largely understood that we tried that approach. It failed. We've had great success in reducing hunger and food insecurity and reducing poverty and hardship through the food stamp program, now called the SNAP program, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And so I do think we're going to stick with that. But we continue to be concerned about proposals that would cut the program, that would increase the paperwork and red tape, that make it harder for people in real need to participate. We're hopeful that there will ultimately be a bipartisan solution that builds on the bipartisanship of the past that is what helped create the program and helped make the big, even though we have significant ways still to go, we have made substantial progress, big progress since 50 years ago And the bipartisanship of the food stamp program has really been the single most important element in that progress.
Well, you know, Stacy and Bob, you can chime in as well. I am a direct product of, you know, that documentary, that reporting that came out in 1968. By the 1970s, my mom was divorced. She was putting herself through graduate school. She was working as a secretary with 2 kids. We were on food stamps. I was on a school lunch program. I remember being extremely embarrassed as a 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old to be on food stamps. But ultimately, as you pointed out, it paved the way to not only putting food on the table for us, but making sure that I had school lunch to eat when I was going to class. And I wonder if the perception in over the last 40 or 50 years around some of these programs has not been of people like my mom, who was working, who was college educated, and who just had a run of bad luck when it came to marriage, but that people somehow are not working and that they are receiving these benefits at the largesse of the government, and that sort of shaded people's perceptions of how important these programs are.
Well, right. 2/3 of participants in SNAP are seniors, people with disabilities, or children. I don't think that's often the stereotype that pops into mind.
So they're not working because they don't have the ability to work. They're children.
Right. They're children.
Seniors.
We don't expect them to work. Right. And of the remaining adults who are there, I think they're very much like, as you described your mom, either someone who's got a temporary family crisis or someone who is supplementing their wages with SNAP. But the very significant share of participants are those who are in between jobs. A lot of low-wage jobs don't offer job stability, they don't offer steady hours, and they don't offer paid leave. So when something comes up in someone's life, like a sick child, folks can lose their job because they took time off to care for a sick child or a sick elder in their life. And similarly, if an employer doesn't offer you the hours, say this week, relative to what they were giving you last week, your income can fall. And that's through no fault of your own. That's just the reality of the low-wage labor market. And SNAP is a really important response to that, ensuring that workers have enough money to feed themselves and their families. And that, many people use the program for short periods of time and go on and are very successful economically and financially, and sometimes are anchors on important news channels, and are taxpayers. Right? It is a part of our community and how we support each other as Americans.
And I think for 2 reasons, the image of the program has actually improved over what it was 40 or 50 years ago. So 40 or 50 years ago, there were more people on the program who were jobless, unemployed, and receiving cash assistance than there were working poor, low-income working families on the program. Today, it's the reverse. A much smaller share of people on the program don't have earnings, other than people who are elderly, disabled, or children. And a much larger share of the program is people who are employed, often full-time. Now, one of the reasons for that is that the minimum wage, adjusted for inflation, is now set about more than 20% below the level it was at in 1968. And so we have many more people today who work full-time but make a wage that leaves them in or close to the poverty line and eligible for food stamps, for SNAP. The program has really become a fundamental support for people who are working hard for low wages. The other key change is that when your mother was on the program, people had little booklets of food stamp coupons.
I remember those very distinctly.
And you ripped out the coupons and handed them to the cashier in the grocery store, and everybody behind you in line saw that you were using food stamps, and it created a stigma. Today, we no longer have food stamp coupons. There's a debit card. Most of us use debit cards when we shop, and so when you're going through the checkout line, the SNAP debit card is not easily distinguishable from a regular debit card. And this has really reduced the stigma in the checkout line. I also think it's one of the factors that has made more working poor families who might have been embarrassed to participate 30 or 40 years ago willing to participate and help better feed their children today. So we really have the program today, today in 2018 and where we are now. This program is really a fundamental part of being able to make ends meet for millions of families that are working, often full-time, year-round, but being paid a wage too low for them otherwise to be able to have adequate food throughout the month for themselves and their children.
But you know, Bob, when I hear you say that, it almost makes me a little sort of more sad. Because I wonder then, if we can have adults working full-time and still not able to feed their family, can we really solve the problem of hunger in this country? Can the federal government solve the problem? Is it a matter of policies, or is it just something that we'll be dealing with for decades and decades to come?
I'm not sure we're ever going to totally eliminate it, but we've made dramatic progress from where we were at the time that the CBS documentary ran in '68. And we can make further substantial progress. I think continued advances, for example, in information technology are making it possible to reduce more of the paperwork in the program. I think if we can get beyond the current kind of debates and be able to not only continue the program as it's working now, in my view, one of the issues in the program is that the benefit levels, the benefits in the program average $1.40 per person per meal. It's quite modest, and the research shows compellingly that many people run out of adequate food in that last week of the month. There is a lot of scientific evidence that the benefit level should be somewhat modestly higher than it is today. I am hoping at some point, it isn't going to happen in 2018, but that in some point our policymakers address that. And that would further help. And then just improvements in other areas, including long overdue to raise the minimum wage to a more adequate level, other kinds of policies of that sort in combination. I think between that and improvements in SNAP, we can make further substantial improvement.
Well, Bob Greenstein and Stacy Dean, thank you so much for spending some time with us to help us bridge this groundbreaking documentary that aired on CBS News in 1968 with the current situation here in this country. I think you really provided a very powerful light on a situation that is still facing millions of Americans today, and we thank you for that.
Thank you.